On a bitterly cold December evening, Marcus Johnson pulled his car into the parking lot of Thompson's grocery store. The weather forecast had predicted snow, and the dark clouds looming overhead suggested it wouldn't be long before the first flakes began to fall. As he stepped out of his warm vehicle, the harsh wind immediately bit at his face, making him grateful for the thick wool coat his mother had gifted him last Christmas. Marcus, a 32-year-old social worker known for his gentle demeanor and warm smile, had just finished another demanding day at the youth center. Despite his exhaustion, he needed to pick up some essential items for tomorrow's community program. As he walked toward the store entrance, something caught his attention from the corner of his eye. At the bus stop across the street, an elderly white woman sat alone, visibly shivering in the cruel winter air. She wore only a thin sweater, clutching her arms tightly around herself in a futile attempt to stay warm. Marcus paused, his shopping list momentarily forgotten as he observed her distress. Without hesitation, he changed direction and crossed the street. As he approached, he could see her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and her whole body trembled uncontrollably. The woman, who he would later learn was Catherine Miller, looked up at him with surprised eyes as his shadow fell across her. "Ma'am, you must be freezing," Marcus said, already shrugging off his coat. "Please, take my coat. I can't bear to see you sitting here like this." Catherine's initial hesitation was evident in her expression. In their small town of Millbrook, where racial tensions still simmered beneath the surface of polite society, such interactions weren't common. But the sincere concern in Marcus's dark brown eyes and the genuine warmth of his smile quickly put her at ease. "Oh, I couldn't possibly." She started to protest, but Marcus was already draping the coat around her shoulders. "I insist," he said firmly but kindly. "I'm Marcus Johnson, by the way. I work at the youth center downtown." The relief was immediate as the warmth from his coat enveloped her. "Thank you, Marcus. I'm Catherine Miller. My car broke down this morning, and I wasn't prepared for this weather when I left home." Instead of continuing to the store, Marcus sat down beside her on the cold bench. He couldn't leave an elderly woman alone in such conditions, even if it meant delaying his errands. They began to talk, and Marcus learned that Catherine was a retired school teacher who still volunteered at the local library's reading program. "The next bus isn't due for another 20 minutes, Catherine said, checking her watch with trembling hands. "Then I'll wait with you," Marcus replied without hesitation. "We can't have you catching pneumonia out here alone." As they sat together, several passers-by cast curious glances their way. Some even slowed their cars to stare at the unusual sight of a young black man sitting with an elderly white woman at a bus stop. But Marcus and Catherine paid them no mind, too engrossed in their conversation about their shared passion for community service. When the bus finally arrived, Catherine tried to return the coat, but Marcus insisted she keep it. "You can return it another time," he said, helping her onto the bus steps. "Just stay warm for now." "You're a good man, Marcus Johnson," Catherine said, her eyes welling with grateful tears. Not many people would show such kindness to a stranger. As Marcus watched the bus pull away, snowflakes began to fall softly around him. He smiled, knowing that despite the cold he now faced without his coat, he had done the right thing. Walking back to his car, he couldn't have known that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. That night, as Marcus drove home in his thin sweater, he thought about Catherine and hoped she had made it home safely. Little did he know that across town, Catherine was sitting in her warm living room, still wearing his coat, and telling her neighbor Robert Wheeler about the kind young man who had helped her at the bus stop. A conversation that would plant the first seeds of the trouble to come. The following evening, Catherine Miller sat in her cozy living room, sipping hot tea and staring at Marcus's coat hanging by her door. She couldn't stop thinking about the young man's kindness, and a plan began forming in her mind. After making a few phone calls to mutual acquaintances at the community center, she managed to get Marcus's work number. When she called the youth center the next morning, Marcus was surprised but pleased to hear her voice. "Mr. Johnson," she said warmly, "I still have your coat, and I simply must repay your kindness. Would you join me for dinner this Friday? I make a mean pot roast." Marcus hesitated briefly, aware of how unusual such an invitation might seem to others. But Catherine's genuine warmth won him over. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Miller. I'd be honored." Friday evening arrived with another burst of winter weather. Marcus pulled up to Catherine's modest two-story house, noting the well-tended garden, now dormant under a thin blanket of snow. The porch light cast a welcoming glow, and the smell of home cooking wafted through the air as he approached the door. Catherine greeted him enthusiastically, ushering him inside out of the cold. Her home was filled with photographs, books, and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. As she took his new coat, he borrowed this one from his brother. She couldn't help but notice it wasn't the same one he'd lent her. "Your coat is freshly cleaned and pressed," she said, gesturing to where it hung. "I hope you didn't miss it too much this week." "Not at all," Marcus replied with a smile, though my brother might say otherwise about his coat. Over dinner, they discovered they had more in common than either expected. Catherine had taught at the same school where many of Marcus's youth center kids attended. They shared stories about the neighborhood, the community's challenges, and their hopes for its future. "You know," Catherine said, serving apple pie for dessert, "I volunteer at the library's reading program 3 days a week. Some of the children struggle so much with basic literacy." Marcus leaned forward, interested. "We have the same issue at the youth center. Many of our kids need extra help with reading and homework." "Perhaps," Catherine suggested, her eyes lighting up, "we could collaborate. I could come to the youth center one afternoon a week. Reading skills are so crucial for these children's futures." As they continued talking, neither noticed Robert Wheeler watching through his window next door. He had been Catherine's neighbor for 20 years, and the sight of a young black man in her home made his jaw clench with unnecessary concern and deep-seated prejudice. The evening grew late, and Marcus helped Catherine clear the dishes despite her protests. As he prepared to leave, she pressed a container of leftover pot roast into his hands. "For being such wonderful company," she insisted. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Miller," Marcus said, standing in the doorway. "It's been a wonderful evening." "Please, call me Catherine," she replied. "And thank you for showing me that kindness still exists in this world. Sometimes we forget that in our rush to judge others." As Marcus walked to his car, Robert Wheeler stepped out onto his porch, watching intently. The older man's presence cast a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Marcus nodded politely in his direction, but Robert merely stared back, his expression hard and unwelcoming. Driving home, Marcus reflected on the evening's warmth and friendship, choosing to focus on the positive rather than the cold reception from Catherine's neighbor. Meanwhile, Catherine sat in her favorite chair, planning how she could help at the youth center, unaware of the storm brewing next door. Robert Wheeler paced in his living room, his mind churning with unfounded suspicions. He had known Catherine since her husband passed away 15 years ago, and he felt responsible for her safety. Tomorrow, he decided, he would have a serious talk with her about being too trusting of strangers, especially ones who, in his prejudiced mind, didn't belong in their neighborhood. The seeds of friendship had been planted between Marcus and Catherine, but alongside them, the weeds of prejudice were taking root in Robert's heart, threatening to overshadow their budding connection. The morning after Marcus's dinner with Catherine, Robert Wheeler marched across his yard with determined steps. The early morning frost crunched beneath his feet as he approached Catherine's front door, his face set in a stern expression. He had barely slept, troubled by what he considered a disturbing development in his friend's life. Catherine answered his aggressive knocking while still in her morning robe, a cup of coffee in hand. "Robert? Is everything all right? It's barely 8 o'clock." "We need to talk," Robert said, pushing past her into the house. His eyes immediately fell on Marcus's coat, still hanging by the door. "About your visitor from last night." Catherine's warm smile faded as she recognized the tone in Robert's voice. She had known him for 20 years and was familiar with his prejudices, though they had never directly addressed them. "Marcus is a wonderful young man, Robert. He works at the youth center downtown." "That's exactly my point," Robert said, pacing her living room. "You don't know anything about him. How could you invite a strange man into your home? What would Thomas think?" He mentioned her late husband's name deliberately, knowing it would strike a chord. Catherine set her coffee down, her hands trembling slightly with anger. "Thomas would have welcomed Marcus just as I did. He was never one to judge people by their appearance, unlike some." "This isn't about appearance," Robert protested, though his reddening face suggested otherwise. "It's about safety. You're a vulnerable widow living alone. He could be casing your house, planning to rob you." "Robert Wheeler." Catherine's voice rose sharply. Marcus gave me his coat when I was freezing at a bus stop. He sat with me for 20 minutes in the cold to make sure I was safe. The dinner was my way of thanking him. But Robert wasn't listening. He walked around the room, noting the valuable antiques Catherine had collected over the years. Did he seem interested in any of your things? Did he ask about living alone? Stop it, Catherine demanded. The only thing Marcus showed interest in was helping more children learn to read. We're planning to collaborate on a program at the youth center. Robert's face darkened further. You can't be serious. You're going to go to that part of town. Catherine, you're being naive. These people? Catherine interrupted, her voice ice cold. Choose your next words very carefully, Robert Wheeler. I've tolerated your concerns for years because you were Thomas's friend, but I won't stand here and listen to this hatred. I'm trying to protect you. Robert's voice rose. You've lived in this neighborhood your whole life. You know how things are, how they should be. This isn't natural, Catherine. Catherine walked to her front door and opened it wide. I think you should leave, Robert. And until you can see past your own prejudice, perhaps it's best if you don't come back. Robert stood frozen, shocked by her reaction. In all their years of friendship, Catherine had never dismissed him like this. You're making a mistake, he said, moving toward the door. Don't come crying to me when something goes wrong. The only mistake here is your judgment of a kind young man who showed more Christian charity in one evening than you have in 20 years of being my neighbor, Catherine replied firmly. As Robert stormed back to his house, Catherine watched him go with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. She had always known this side of him existed, but seeing it displayed so openly broke her heart. Looking at Marcus's coat still hanging by her door, she made a decision. She wouldn't let Robert's prejudice poison the new friendship she had found. Inside his house, Robert seethed with anger and wounded pride. He picked up his phone and began making calls to other longtime neighbors, spreading his concerns about Catherine's new friend. As he spoke, his words grew more twisted, painting Marcus as a threat to their peaceful neighborhood. What had started as a simple act of kindness was now sparking a fire of prejudice that would soon threaten to burn out of control. Neither Marcus nor Catherine could have guessed that their growing friendship would become the catalyst for exposing the deep-rooted prejudices that lurked beneath their community's surface. Over the next 3 weeks, the friendship between Marcus Johnson and Catherine Miller blossomed, defying the whispers that circulated through their small town. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Catherine would arrive at the youth center, her arms loaded with books and her heart full of enthusiasm for their new reading program. The children at the center quickly grew to love Miss Catherine, as they called her. She had a way of making stories come alive, using different voices for each character and encouraging the kids to act out scenes. Marcus often found himself pausing in his work just to watch her interact with the young students, reminded of why he'd chosen this career in the first place. One particularly busy Thursday, Marcus noticed Catherine struggling with her heavy book bag as she entered the center. Here, let me help you with that, he said, rushing to take the bag from her shoulders. Oh, thank you, dear. Catherine smiled, rubbing her arm. I might have been a bit ambitious with my book selection today. Marcus frowned slightly. You know, I drive right past your neighborhood on my way here. I could pick you up on program days. Catherine's face lit up at the offer, but then fell slightly. That would be wonderful, but are you sure? Robert has been spreading such awful stories about you. I wouldn't want to cause more trouble. I've dealt with people like Robert my whole life, Marcus replied gently. We can't let their fears stop us from doing what's right. And so began their new routine. Twice a week, Marcus would pick up Catherine in his car, often arriving early to help her carry groceries or fix small things around her house. She, in turn, would send him home with containers of home-cooked meals, insisting that he was too skinny and needed proper feeding. Their friendship didn't go unnoticed. Some neighbors stopped speaking to Catherine altogether, while others watched with disapproving eyes whenever Marcus's car pulled into her driveway. Robert Wheeler's campaign of whispered accusations grew more intense, but it had an unexpected effect. It revealed who Catherine's true friends were. Mrs. Anderson from across the street started joining Catherine at the youth center. Mr. Peters, the retired librarian, donated boxes of books to their program. Slowly, a small but supportive community began to form around their friendship. One evening, after a particularly successful reading session, Marcus and Catherine sat in her kitchen sharing a pot of tea. You know, Catherine said, stirring honey into her cup. Thomas would have loved what we're doing here. Tell me about him, Marcus asked, having heard mentions of Catherine's late husband but never the full story. He was a high school teacher. Catherine smiled, lost in memory. He believed education was the key to breaking down barriers. In 1968, he was one of the first teachers in our district to support integration. Lost a lot of friends over it, but he never wavered. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like you're carrying on his legacy. I suppose I am, Catherine replied, wiping away a tear. Though I wish I'd had his courage years ago. It took meeting you to make me realize how much work there still is to do. As they talked, neither noticed Robert Wheeler standing in his darkened living room, watching through the window, his hands clenched into fists as he saw them laughing together. In his mind, their innocent friendship represented everything he feared about the changing world around him. That night, after Marcus had left, Catherine found an anonymous note in her mailbox. You're a disgrace to Thomas's memory. She recognized Robert's handwriting immediately. Instead of fear or shame, she felt pity for her former friend, whose heart had become so hardened by hate. Marcus, driving home, reflected on how one simple act of kindness had led to such meaningful change in both their lives. The youth center's reading scores were improving, more community members were getting involved, and he had gained a dear friend in Catherine. But dark clouds were gathering. Robert Wheeler's anger was building day by day, fed by his own prejudices and the changes he couldn't accept. Like a pot left too long on the stove, his resentment was about to boil over, threatening to scald everyone in its path. Robert Wheeler sat in his dimly lit living room, a half-empty whiskey bottle on the table beside him. Through his window, he watched Marcus's car pull up to Catherine's house for the third time that week. His television played quietly in the background, but his attention remained fixed on the scene outside. Bringing shame to the whole neighborhood, he muttered, pouring another drink with shaking hands. Over the past weeks, his obsession with Catherine and Marcus's friendship had grown dangerously. He'd lost sleep, spent hours making angry phone calls to old friends, and started drinking more heavily than usual. Earlier that day, he'd seen them at the local grocery store together. Catherine had been helping Marcus select vegetables for the youth center's new cooking program, their easy laughter echoing through the aisles. The sight had sent him into a rage, and he'd left his shopping cart abandoned in the middle of the store. Now, as evening settled over the neighborhood, he watched Catherine emerge from her house wearing a nice dress. Marcus, ever the gentleman, held her car door open. They were heading to a community event at the youth center, a celebration of the reading program's success. Going out like they're on a date, Robert snarled, draining his glass. The alcohol had been fueling his anger all afternoon, distorting his perception of their innocent friendship into something sinister. In his mind, every interaction between them was an affront to the memory of Thomas, Catherine's late husband, and his former best friend. He grabbed his car keys, then stopped, remembering the amount he'd had to drink. Instead, he decided to walk. The youth center wasn't far, and the exercise might clear his head, but as he stumbled down the sidewalk, his thoughts only grew darker. Along the way, he passed other neighbors who had attended his impromptu community meetings about the situation. Most nodded politely but hurried past, increasingly uncomfortable with his obvious intoxication and growing obsession. The community center's windows glowed warmly in the evening darkness. Through them, Robert could see a crowd gathered for the celebration. Catherine stood at a podium, presenting certificates to the young readers while Marcus beamed proudly from the side. Robert watched as several parents approached Marcus, shaking his hand and thanking him for the program's success. He saw Catherine join them, placing her hand on Marcus's arm as she shared some joke that made everyone laugh. Trying to take over everything, Robert muttered, his anger building. Changing the whole neighborhood, making all of us look like fools. He waited in the shadows as the event wound down. Parents left with their children, volunteers cleaned up, and finally, Marcus and Catherine emerged into the cool night air. They were discussing plans for expanding the program, their breath visible in the chilly evening. Let me walk you to your car, Marcus said to Catherine. It's gotten pretty dark. Robert followed them at a distance, weaving slightly as he walked. The whiskey in his system made everything seem distant and dreamlike, except for his rage, which felt more real with each step. When they turned down the poorly lit alley that served as a shortcut to the parking lot, Robert saw his opportunity. He watched Catherine thank Marcus for the evening and continue ahead to her car, leaving Marcus alone in the alley. The scene before him blurred, distorted by alcohol and hatred. In his mind, he wasn't about to attack an innocent man. He was protecting his neighborhood, defending Catherine's honor, preserving Thomas's memory. As Marcus turned to head back to the center, Robert stepped out of the shadows. His fingers curled into fists, and the whiskey singing in his veins drowned out the last voice of reason in his mind. What he didn't notice was Catherine, who had realized she'd forgotten her purse and was hurrying back down the alley. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change their small community forever, fueled by one man's inability to accept the simple friendship that had grown from a single act of kindness on a cold winter evening. The alley was dark except for a single flickering streetlight that cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. Marcus had just bid Catherine good night and was turning to head back to the youth center when he heard heavy footsteps behind him. "Hey, boy," Robert's voice slurred through the darkness. "We need to talk about you and Catherine." Marcus turned slowly, immediately recognizing the threatening tone in Robert's voice. The smell of whiskey hung heavy in the air between them. "Mr. Wheeler, you're drunk. Let me call you a cab." "Don't act like you care," Robert spat, stumbling forward. "You think you can come into our neighborhood, charm your way into people's homes, acting all proper and educated." Marcus raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, taking a step back. "This doesn't have to get ugly. We're both reasonable men." "Reasonable?" Robert laughed bitterly. "There's nothing reasonable about what you're doing. You've turned Catherine against me, against everything we believe in." Meanwhile, Catherine had realized she'd left her purse at the center and was hurrying back down the alley. She heard the voices before she saw them, and the anger in Robert's tone made her blood run cold. "Catherine is my friend," Marcus said calmly, though his heart was racing. "Just like she's your friend. There's room in her life for both of us." "Friend?" Robert's voice rose to a shout. "You're destroying everything. Our neighborhood, our values, our way of life." He lunged forward suddenly, pushing Marcus hard against the brick wall. "Robert, stop." Catherine's voice rang out, but it was too late. Robert's fist connected with Marcus's jaw, decades of prejudice behind the blow. Marcus, refusing to fight back, tried to protect himself while avoiding any aggressive moves. But Robert, fueled by alcohol and hate, kept coming. "You're nothing but a..." Robert began spewing racial slurs as he landed another punch, this one catching Marcus in the ribs. Catherine fumbled for her phone with shaking hands, dialing 911 as she screamed for help. Her voice echoed off the alley walls, drawing attention from people still leaving the community center. "Emergency services? Please hurry." Catherine's voice cracked with terror. "There's an assault in progress in the alley behind the youth center on Mason Street." Marcus finally lost his footing on the wet pavement, falling hard. Robert kicked him, continuing to shout slurs and accusations. Blood trickled from Marcus's split lip, staining his white dress shirt. Two young men from the center heard the commotion and came running. They pulled Robert away from Marcus, restraining him as he struggled and cursed. One of them recognized him as Catherine's neighbor and couldn't believe what they were witnessing. "You're ruining everything," Robert continued to shout, even as the sound of police sirens grew closer. "This isn't how things are supposed to be." Catherine knelt beside Marcus, her hands trembling as she helped him sit up. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This is all my fault." "No," Marcus said firmly, despite his pain. "This isn't your fault. This is about his hate, not our friendship." The police arrived moments later, their red and blue lights illuminating the scene in harsh flashes. They found Robert still struggling against the men holding him, Marcus bleeding on the ground, and Catherine crying as she held a tissue to his cut lip. Several witnesses from the center came forward immediately, describing what they'd seen and heard. The racial nature of Robert's attack was clear from his continued slurs and ranting, even as the police handcuffed him. As paramedics checked Marcus's injuries, Catherine stood nearby, her heart breaking for her friend and for the ugly truth about her longtime neighbor that had finally been exposed. The alley that had moments ago been filled with violence was now buzzing with police radios and concerned voices. "Will you press charges?" one officer asked Marcus as they finished taking his statement. Marcus looked at Catherine, then at Robert being placed in the police car. "Yes," he said quietly, "not for revenge, but because this has to stop. The hate has to stop. The night that should have been a celebration of community and progress had instead revealed the deep wounds still festering beneath the surface of their town. As the police cars drove away and the paramedics finished treating Marcus, no one realized that this violent episode would become a turning point for their entire community. The courthouse was packed on the morning of Robert Wheeler's hearing. 3 weeks had passed since the violent attack in the alley, and the case had become a focal point for the entire community. Marcus sat in the front row, his bruises mostly healed but the memory still fresh. Catherine sat beside him, her back straight and her expression determined. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Martinez entered the courtroom. The rustling of people standing filled the air, followed by tense silence as Robert was led in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. During the proceedings, the prosecution presented their evidence methodically. They played cell phone videos captured by witnesses, showing Robert's racist tirade and violent assault. Catherine watched her former friend's face as he saw himself on screen, wondering if he felt any remorse. When it was Catherine's turn to testify, she walked to the witness stand with steady steps. Her voice never wavered as she recounted not only the attack, but also the weeks of harassment and intimidation that had preceded it. "Robert Wheeler was my neighbor for 20 years, she testified, looking directly at him. "He was my late husband's friend. But the man who attacked Marcus that night wasn't the person I thought I knew. That man was consumed by hatred." Marcus's testimony came next. Despite everything, he spoke with dignity and composure. "I never wanted to fight Mr. Wheeler," he explained to the court. "Even when he was attacking me, I only tried to protect myself. I believe in solving problems through understanding, not violence." The defense tried to paint Robert's actions as an alcohol-fueled mistake, but the evidence of premeditation was too strong. His threatening notes to Catherine, the witnesses who described his weeks of organizing against Marcus, and the clearly racial nature of the attack left little room for doubt. Several community members who had attended Robert's meetings came forward, now ashamed of their silence. They described how he had tried to rally others against Marcus and Catherine's friendship, spreading fears and hatred through the neighborhood. "I should have spoken up sooner," Mrs. Anderson testified, her voice thick with regret. "We all should have. By staying quiet, we let this hatred grow." During a break in the proceedings, Marcus and Catherine sat on a courthouse bench, sharing a quiet moment. "I keep thinking about Thomas," Catherine said softly. "You would have been so disappointed in Robert." Marcus squeezed her hand. "But he would have been proud of you, standing up for what's right." When the judge delivered her verdict, the courtroom was silent. Robert Wheeler was found guilty of assault motivated by racial hatred, a hate crime. His sentence included jail time, mandatory counseling, and a restraining order preventing him from approaching either Marcus or Catherine. As Robert was led away, he finally looked at Catherine, his face showing a mix of shame and confusion, as if he was only now beginning to understand the consequences of his actions. Catherine met his gaze steadily, neither angry nor afraid anymore, just disappointed. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to cover the story. Marcus spoke briefly, emphasizing the need for healing and understanding in the community. Catherine stood beside him, her presence a testament to their unshaken friendship. "This verdict isn't about punishment," Marcus told the cameras. "It's about acknowledging that hate has no place in our community. We can't change the past. We can choose how we move forward." The local newspaper's headline the next day read, "Justice served in hate crime case. Community stands united against racism." Below it was a photograph of Marcus and Catherine leaving the courthouse together, their heads held high. That evening, Catherine hosted a small gathering at her home for those who had supported them through the trial. The same living room where Robert had once voiced his prejudices was now filled with people of different races and backgrounds, all sharing food and conversation. "You know," Marcus said as he helped Catherine serve coffee, "something good has come from all this. Look around. People who never would have met are now friends." Catherine nodded, watching her diverse group of guests interact. "Sometimes it takes darkness to help us appreciate the light," she replied, "and to show us who will stand beside us when we need them most." The case had forced their community to confront its hidden prejudices, but it had also revealed the strength of those willing to stand against hatred. As the sun set outside Catherine's windows, it seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, more hopeful one. 6 months after Robert Wheeler's conviction, The old Anderson building on Main Street buzzed with activity. What had once been an abandoned warehouse was now transformed into the Millbrook Unity Center. Marcus stood in the entrance, watching volunteers hang a bright banner across the newly painted walls. The center had been his and Catherine's vision, a place where people of all backgrounds could come together to learn, share, and grow. Local businesses and residents had rallied behind the project, donating money, materials, and time. Marcus, Catherine called from across the room, waving him over. She was organizing books in the new library section, her silver hair neatly pinned back as she worked. Come see what Mrs. Anderson just brought in. The shelves were filled with books representing diverse cultures and experiences. Children's stories in multiple languages sat alongside histories of civil rights movements and guides to understanding different cultures. Each book was a step toward the understanding they hoped to build. We received another letter from Robert today, Catherine said quietly, once Marcus reached her. Since beginning his counseling in prison, Robert had started writing to them through his lawyer. His letters showed slow but steady progress in confronting his prejudices. What did he say? Marcus asked, helping her arrange the last of the books. He's been working with a prison diversity group, she replied. He said he finally understands what Thomas was trying to tell him all those years ago about equality. He's asking if he can donate his carpentry skills to the center when he's released. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Redemption takes time, but it's possible for those who truly want to change. The center's grand opening attracted hundreds of people. Families from all parts of town came together, sharing food from different cultures and participating in workshops designed to bridge divides. The youth reading program, which had started it all, now had its own dedicated space. Local news cameras captured the moment as Marcus and Catherine cut the ribbon together. This center, Marcus announced to the crowd, is proof that love is stronger than hate, that understanding can overcome fear, and that friendship knows no boundaries. Catherine's eyes welled with tears as she looked out at the diverse faces before her. My late husband Thomas always said that education and connection were the keys to breaking down barriers, she added. Today, we honor that belief. The center quickly became a symbol of positive change in Millbrook. Former skeptics who had once whispered behind closed doors now attended cultural exchange events. Children who might never have interacted outside school played together in the center's recreation area. The walls that had once divided their community were slowly crumbling. 1 year to the day after the attack, Marcus and Catherine sat in the center's garden, watching children plant flowers together. The garden had been designed as a place of healing and growth, with benches dedicated to victims of hate crimes. Did you ever imagine, Catherine asked, that lending your coat to a freezing old lady would lead to all this? Marcus smiled, looking around at what they had built together. No, but it proves that even the smallest act of kindness can create huge changes. They had received word that Robert was making progress in prison, leading discussion groups about confronting racism and working to understand his own prejudices. While they weren't ready to forgive him completely, they recognized the importance of his journey toward change. The center became a model for other communities struggling with similar issues. Visitors came from neighboring towns to learn how they could create their own unity centers. Marcus and Catherine were invited to speak at conferences about community healing and reconciliation. As the sun set on another busy day at the center, Marcus locked up while Catherine waited by her car. They had their weekly dinner planned, a tradition that had survived despite everything that had happened. You know what I think? Catherine said as they walked to their cars. I think we've created something that will outlast all of us. Something that will keep growing and changing lives long after we're gone. Marcus looked back at the building, its windows still glowing warmly in the dusk. That's the best kind of legacy we could leave, he replied. A world where kindness wins over hate, where bridges replace barriers, and where one simple act of humanity can transform an entire community. The story of the black man who helped a cold lady and the friendship that overcame hatred became more than just a local legend. It became a testament to the power of human connection and a reminder that change, though sometimes painful, was always possible for those brave enough to embrace it.